Our next lecture on World War II deals with the Pacific Theater of Operations in the Second World War. We're just to give a little refresher. We talked about this in our third lecture on World War II, a lot more in depth, but we left off talking about Japan and the Pacific is the December 7th, 1941 surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. We went to a lot more in depth of that, but again, the Japanese launched a surprise attack, catch the Pacific Fleet. It's kind of asleep on early Sunday morning, and they launched two pretty costly waves that killed nearly 2,500 sailors and Americans. Importantly, remember though, we have in our study guides that the Japanese did not destroy the U.S. aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor, and they did not destroy the oil reserves or the logistical facilities of the fleet. And that's going to be important moving forward as we go. Now, we also said, remember, that Pearl Harbor is not just a singular event, it is part of a broad trans-Pacific Japanese offensive, where after the first 6 months following Pearl Harbor, the Japanese are conquering a giant empire in the Pacific Ocean, much larger than what the Nazis had in a comparable time period. This is including launching attacks into the American-held Philippines. Over 80,000 Americans and their Filipino allies fought the Japanese in the islands there under the command of Douglas MacArthur. The Japanese, in overwhelming force, fought them down the main island in the Philippines, down the Bataan Peninsula to the fortress of Corregidor, and it was there that Douglas MacArthur was ordered by Roosevelt to leave and come back to Washington and come back to the United States. And MacArthur looked at the message and said, "Yeah, sure, all right." And he left there, and he left the Americans to be captured. Um, he's left. He goes there. The American prisoners of war that are left are then forced to march back up the Bataan Peninsula under heavy duress, without food, without water, without very little rest, and this becomes known as the Bataan Death March. As you can probably imagine, not a considerable amount of those Americans survived the march from there. As you can imagine, after Pearl Harbor and after losses in the Philippines and in other places, the Americans into 1942 are only seeing losses. The Japanese are beating them here, beating them there. So they're looking for something, anything that is going to be able to kind of lift their spirits, to be able to be an attack, a reprisal, revenge for the Pearl Harbor attack. So on April 18th, 1942, one of the great American aviators, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, led a 16 bomber raid to attack Tokyo. And they only have about 30 seconds over Tokyo, and it's the famous movie called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo from there, where they take these bombers that have no business being on an aircraft carrier, strip them of anything that's non essential, be able to carry as much fuel and as many bombs as possible to be able to launch from their extreme range, drop their bombs over Tokyo, and then try to run away as fast as they can. The Doolittle raid itself does some damage in Tokyo. It shatters some windows, causes some destruction. Militarily, really, it accomplishes nothing. It's not that important in a military sense. Most of these planes and pilots aren't going to be recovered, and so you're losing this there. But psychologically, it provides a huge boost for the United States. It is kind of the first success against the Japanese. It marks the ability for the Americans to go and attack them on their home islands. Japan is shocked to find that there's American bombers flying overhead and dropping bombs from there. So they decide that their next course of action is to close off this corridor from which these American aircraft carriers came from, and they decide to move to the island of Midway as their next target in order to be able to shut off this avenue attack for the Americans. So again, the Americans are forced to surrender along with their Filipino allies in the end of March of 1942. They were then forced, as you can see here on the Bataan Death March, up the Bataan Peninsula, again without much rest or food or water, with reprisals happening from the Japanese all along the way. In response to this and other further Japanese losses from the Americans, the raid is launched, and you can kind of see the Americans put bombers on aircraft carriers, sent them their extreme range, launched the bombers. The carriers turned tail and ran away, and then they would drop their bombs and then try to see if they could make it to Chinese-held China, or to the Soviet Union, hopefully able to crash land or be able to find Chinese sympathizers along the way. This was the brainchild of the famous aviator Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. And again, him and his B-24 bombers were put on these aircraft carriers, which weren't meant to be launched this way, and stripped of kind of all their defensive armament just so that they could fly over and drop their bombs from there. Uh, the War in the Pacific is going to be fought again with all the naval aspect of it, and so it's going to have some unique things as the way the war at sea is fought shifts away from being done since it's been done time immemorial for ship-to-ship combat to where it's being done by aircraft carriers and airplanes. The Battle of the Coral Sea is one of the major kind of markers of this. This occurs in May of 1942, and this is a unique naval battle. So this is your little trivia fact about that, into where there was no shots fired by any surface ships, any ships with kind of the big guns or battleships or destroyers, the ships you're kind of used to during this battle. All the fighting is done by aircraft. The Battle of the Coral Sea also marks the first time a Japanese invasion has been stopped, but the Japanese themselves are more worried about capturing Midway Island. And this leads towards the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. Now, as we've discussed previously, the United States has broken the Japanese diplomatic code, and they've broken most of the Japanese military code. So they know that kind of what the Japanese general idea is. And so U.S. intelligence forces has a pretty solid idea that Midway is next, but the U.S. Kind of chiefs of staffs wants the definitive. So they actually um, kind of worked the Japanese and they played a trick on them to try to figure out if this Midway Island was exactly what they wanted. So they told the defenders on Midway Island, the Americans there, to send out a message in the clear without being coded or anything that says, "Hey, we're running low on fresh water. Is there any way we could get a update or a quicker shipment from there?" Then the Americans monitored the Japanese messaging, and the island that they saw that the Japanese keep mentioning as code words, a nuke messages came from the Japanese said that, hey, this island is running low on water, and that's when the United States knew that Midway was the next target. So the admiral of the Pacific Fleet are in charge of the ships for the United States, Chester Nimitz, moved the fleet to then try to defend Midway Island from there. The Japanese were successfully able to launch an attack from their aircraft carriers onto the island of Midway itself. They're able to drop a lot of bombs and do several damage there. But the Japanese are the Midway Island is not so much important itself. The Japanese are aware that there could possibly be a U.S. aircraft carrier, which, as we're starting to see, is going to become the dominant way of fighting in the Pacific. The United States knows that the Japanese aircraft carriers are there, and so they're circling around and trying to find them. So the Americans launch all their planes from the decks of their aircraft carriers. The Japanese begin to, after bombing the island of Midway, begin to land back on their aircraft carrier, and that's where the admiral for the Japanese has to come up with an important idea. He begins to go and say, all right, we're going to launch a second wave, so begin to rearm all of our airplanes and refuel them, right, with bombs to be able to launch another attack on Midway Island to prepare for an invasion from our uh, kind of marine forces from there. It's that moment as the Japanese planes begin to land back, flying back from Midway, begin to refuel and begin to have the bombs put on there, that the Japanese receive word from one of their scout planes that they found an aircraft carrier, or what looks to be an aircraft carrier. And so as the admiral then begins to say, "Oh, stop what you're doing, put in more extra fuel, you have to switch the bombs, take off the bombs. They're going to drop Midway, put on the bombs, they're going to be dropped on the American aircraft carriers. And then, as they're trying to figure out, as they're trying to get this message and confirm, is there's actually the aircraft carriers from there. And all this is happening. There's a whole lot of stuff on the deck. There's bombs from two different types of bombs. There's all this fuel, and that's when the American torpedo bombers show up. These big, slow, dauntless torpedo bombers that are slow and lumbering and are coming on there and have to find a very straight path in order to be able to drop their torpedoes and go from there. The Japanese pounce on them, launching all of their planes that are flying protection over the aircraft carriers down onto them and destroy to a plane every single one of these torpedo bombers. It's at that point, with the Japanese having all of their planes on the deck, having all of that fuel and all of the different types of bombs and the fighter cover above the aircraft carriers as a fence lowered to defend against the torpedo bombers, that the American dive bombers show up high above the skies. And in just 5 minutes, the entire war changes in the Pacific. Sometimes, again, we talk about stuff that takes days or months to do or change that occurs over centuries. Here, this is a clear point where w- the the tables, the pages of world history turn in just 5 short minutes. After 5 minutes, the Americans leave three Japanese aircraft carriers sinking down to the bottom of the Pacific, one heavily damaged. They're going to destroy it the next day. And this marks a clear, distinct turning point in the Pacific. Just like the Battle of Stalingrad in Europe, Midway is the turning point in the Pacific. This marks the end of the Japanese advance across the ocean, and it begins the United States advance towards Japan. The United States is going to, from Nimitz, launch a plan, what they call island hopping across the Pacific. And this is a pretty simple, straightforward definition. You can just write this down yourself here of hopping, going from island to island to island, moving closer and closer towards the Japanese home islands from there. And that's the basic plan the Americans come up with, be able to break the Japanese defenses. So World War II in the Pacific is going to be fought not by big giant battleships, but by aircraft carriers, boats with flat decks to be able to launch and retrieve fighter planes from the skies, which is again kind of shown in the Battle of Midway, where you have the dive bombers and torpedo bombers flying overhead and launching from there, and that's a big thing. They then Americans with the U.S. Marines go from island to island, island, going from Tarawa to Etobicoke to Peleliu, working their way across the Pacific, going from island to island, island, launching invasion after invasion of these islands and playing baseball along the way, because again, that's what Americans do. Following Midway, the offensive island hopping begins on the island of Guadalcanal in August of 1942. This is the first Allied offensive operation in the Pacific, and it also marks the first Japanese defeat on land when the Americans are able to defeat them at Guadalcanal. They then, again, we don't have time to go through every single island, but they keep going island to island and island across the Pacific Ocean. By the time we get to October of 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf marks another major uh, part of the Pacific War, where the Japanese know that the Americans are going to be invading into the Pacific, the Philippines Islands again. So they launch their entire fleet into the battle, including a brand new tactic that we see for the first time, and this is the use of kamikazes. Kamikazes are suicide planes who purposely crash their explosive laden planes into American ships. You can think of this as kind of like guided missiles, but instead of computer chips guiding the missile into a target, this is brains in Japanese pilots' heads who are then going from there. By October of 1944, that experienced and dangerous and most highly trained and equipped fighter pilot force that the Japanese had in Pearl Harbor is gone, dead, and they haven't been able to provide the training to the pilots, unlike what the Americans are able to do with all their resources back in the United States. And so, again, you have things like with the Marianas turkey shoot, where the Americans are shooting down planes left and right. And so, what the Japanese turn to is this idea of, well, let's just use suicide planes, which is a lot harder to take down. They're very it's a lot. You don't have to train somebody to plan the plane. You just train it to go and drive it into the right spot from there. Pretty devastating results. Over 480 ships are sunk in the Philippines by kamikaze pilots during the Philippines campaign from there. To circle back to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the battle is a complete and total disaster militarily for the Japanese. And just like the Battle of the Bulge, the Battle of Leyte Gulf is a last gasp attack by the Japanese. It destroys the power of the Japanese Navy, and really they're only able to retreat from this point forward. Guadalcanal is in a famous book and a movie called The Thin Red Line. If you can read that or watch that, it describes that battle from there. And again, like both, introduces the idea of kamikazes of these planes going and crashing into the sides, causing a heck of a lot of damage once they're are doing from there. So as we turn the calendar into 1945, the United States begins to hop closer and closer towards the Japanese home islands. By February of 1945, the United States has its eyes set on Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is needed as an airfield. The United States wants this kind of pretty much just a hunk of rock in the middle of the Pacific as an emergency landing place, and also be able to take away the island from the Japanese who are launching airplanes, who are causing problems for B-29s flying from the Marianas Islands to bomb the home islands of Japan. The, the Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima know that this attack is coming, and they're anticipating it for a couple months. So the volcanic island of Iwo Jima, with the dormant volcano Mount Suribachi dominating it, is turned into an elaborate fortress by the Japanese defenders. Lots of caves, tunnels, the big artillery guns on the mountain were said to have the entire island, zeroed in and ranged in to the inch, and machine guns dotted the islands, which allowed for the Japanese defenders to pop up, fire off several rounds, dive back down to the tunnels, and go from there, which obviously made it a major problem for the United States. Over 6,000 U.S. Marines died in the invasion of Iwo Jima. Over 20,000 Marines were wounded, and it was said they died with the greatest possible violence. Iwo Jima marked a real turning point in the ferocity of the defense of an island by the Japanese. The Americans actually ran low on flamethrower fuel because of how frequently they were using it in order to be able to remove the Japanese defenders from the island. The Japanese on the island are going to die virtually to a man. There's very few Japanese that surrender as prisoners. Over 20,700 Japanese soldiers die defending the island of Iwo Jima from the Americans. And so you can start to see that the island of Iwo Jima marks a really turning point in the defense of the Japanese home islands as the Americans are getting closer and closer. And the Japanese are more digging in their heels and unwilling to give up some of the stuff, as you can see the kind of danger and explosions that's going on from there. It's Iwo Jima that marks the famous flag raising on the top of Mount Suribachi. Oh, wait, not that one. It's there you go. It's that one from there that again is a pretty famous picture from the photographer Rosenthal, which is eventually going to turn into the Marine Corps monument. Mount Iwo Jima basically is a giant graveyard today. You can watch the movies Flags of Our Fathers and its companion piece Letters from Iwo Jima, which describes the invasion from both the American and Japanese viewpoint from there. The next target is Okinawa, and that's invaded by the Americans in April of 1945. And Okinawa is considered by Japanese part of the far end of the Japanese archipelago, but more importantly, a part of the Japanese home islands. And so we see another even more increased ferocity of defense of Okinawa than we saw even on Iwo Jima. Over 1,900 kamikaze attacks were launched on the U.S. invasion fleet of Okinawa, killing over 5,000 American sailors and seamen from there. The Japanese fight with an unseen ferocity to protect the island, along with non-military civilians living on the island of Okinawa as well. Over 110,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians die on the island of Okinawa to prevent its capture from the Americans. The United States, right, loses over 7,600 soldiers fighting across the island. And so when you add that, over 12,000 Americans die trying to take, again, Okinawa. And so you can start to see the increased cost that the Japanese are inflicting on the Americans as they get closer and closer and closer invading into Japan. So that's the island of Okinawa. Again, they're fighting across it. It's pretty ferocious. Again, this is I think a 3 second or 6 second exposure of anti-aircraft fire over a deck of one of the aircraft carriers, and you can just see every sixth bullet uh, in some of these machine guns was what's called a tracer bullet, and so we just job is to light it up so you can kind of see where your bullets are going. So you can see there's six for every one of these lines. There's six bullets in front of that line, six bullets behind that. And so you can start to see just the ferocity of the increased Japanese attacks that are launching these big, huge, giant explosions and sinking ships with American soldiers on there. And in the retaliation, the Americans strapped bombs to bats to create bat bombs, right, to go and inflict further damage on the Japanese from them. So as we begin to get closer and closer and closer to the Japanese home islands, the Americans begin by increasing the amount of bombing attacks from airplanes in the sky towards them, including tactics called firebombing these cities. The first use of a firebomb to be able to drop so much explosives to be able to create kind of a firestorm within the city was tried out first in Germany, in the city of Dresden on February 13th, 1945. Over 1,400 Allied aircraft dropped 650,000 incendiary bombs on the city. An incendiary bomb, its job is to not kind of explode and make a crater, but to spread out and create kind of a fire, a fire and just burn us from there. American POWs who are actually in Dresden, right, described a city of 130,000 corpses left over. They described being forced to go by the Germans into the city to clear out dead bodies from cellars that looked perfectly fine, but suffocated because the fire was so intense that it just sucked all the oxygen out of there as they moved towards that. And so, with the success of this in Dresden, the Americans then turn around and do this to the Japanese in the city of Tokyo with the Tokyo firebombing of March 9th through 10th, 1945. This night, over 15.8 square miles of the city of Tokyo was burnt. It was said it had gotten so hot during the night that the canal waters in Tokyo boiled over from the heat. 100,000 Japanese people died in the Tokyo fire bombings. And when we talk about the atomic bombs in our next lecture, you'll see that that's more than died in the Hiroshima bombing and more than died in the separate Nagasaki bombing. It's estimated that over 1 million Japanese civilians in Tokyo were injured from the bombing itself. American bombers, bomber pilots described being able to be able to navigate towards the city of Tokyo hours out because of the light on the horizon. And bombers described being flipped over, right, as they fly from the extreme updrafts of the intensity of that. And this marked the beginning of a 10-day period in March of 1945 where 32 square miles of Japan's four largest cities, all right, were bombed out, and the Americans killed at least 150,000 Japanese, plus tens of thousands of more that weren't accurately counted. Why it's a 10-day period and not 11, 15, or 20-day is because the Americans actually ran out of bombs being brought over from the United States to be dropped on Japan, and they simply just didn't have enough to drop on there, and so they couldn't do any more from that. So again, we're going to pause a little bit here and talk about a little bit more of the bombers, the idea of trying to attack not only manufacturing of enemy combatants, but also be able to inflict terror campaigns from the sky by dropping big giant bombs in the American B-24 or B-17 bombers for the most part. These are flying, again, several thousand feet up into the sky. They're unpressurized, and so it's obviously very cold up there, and oxygen is needed by the crews in order to be able to fight in these very cramped things. The bomber crews that actually went up there include all of these people, but it took a whole lot of people and mechanics and support staff on the ground in order to be able to keep these bombers fueled and in flight and going to be able to drop again in pretty giant formations and dropping several tons of bombs um, in each of these different runs from there. These formations were so tight, you can kind of see that accidents like this happened, where and stuff from there. And again, some of these cities like Cologne were completely and totally bombed out. Uh, this is the city of Dresden. You can kind of see in 1945 the damage that was done, and then from the same angle, what it looks like in 1955, you can see the amount of destruction that was rained upon the city of what was left that was usable 10 years after the war was over. Again, the city of Dresden becomes again a city of death with a whole lot of people burnt to little crisps from there, and again, places like Nuremberg were pockmarked with craters and shell holes as the Americans then turned their focus towards the Japanese. You can see all the different bombs being dropped here on that harbor as a forerunner for, again, dropping and bombing out 15 square miles of Tokyo, the Tokyo fire bombings, that again, reducing a lot of the people there into not a lot of great stuff as they went on. So this kind of explains why the islands of Okinawa and Iwo Jima are needed because the Americans are dropping all these bombs on the Japanese. If you take the Japanese cities that are being bombed by the Americans and kind of if you reverse that, I mean the Americans are going down to the Peoria, Illinois, the Davenport, Iowas of Japan and bombing all those different cities out. So this is kind of the reverse stuff. We can kind of tell you just how many, what percentage of stuff from there. So these are both kind of the equivalents of there. You can start to see um, the amount of stuff we're going. They're bombing out the Grand Rapids, Michigan of Japan in order to be able to go and fight their way towards this. So we're gonna. This is a good stopping point. We're gonna stop here with the United States having its eyes focused on invading Japanese home islands and what their kind of plan of attack here as we move into the late summer of 1945.